But having thanked everyone, it's now time to turn to the book itself. And I don't want to say too much because I'd be as curious as you are to find out what Nidhi wants to talk about, what she is curious to ask about. And eventually the plan is that we'll open it up to the audience, and all of you may have questions or comments that you'd like to share with us as well. But just very briefly about the origin of this book, it began somewhat unusually as a speech. I gather that before we came to the stage, they were playing the speech on the screen, a speech at the Oxford Union in the summer of last year, which, to my astonishment, went viral on YouTube. And I say to my astonishment simply because I had rather naively assumed that, frankly, this is something that everybody already knows in India. I certainly felt that I had known much of it all my life since my student days in history and having done an honors degree in history in college. But when my publisher rang me up and said, look, you've absolutely got to turn this into a book. And I said, what's the point? Everybody already knows this. His answer was, no, they don't, because if they did, your speech wouldn't have gone viral, which seemed to make some sense. I said, all right, I'll give it a try and see what I can do to write a book. Mind you, the amount of preparation you need for a 15-minute speech is not quite what you need to do for what turned out to be a 333-page book. So it gave me an opportunity to relive my doctoral dissertation days in terms of research, except that research nowadays is so much easier than it would have been had I written this book just a generation ago. During my dissertation days, the sitting in musty libraries, trudging from place to place, taking copious notes by hand, reassembling them into a coherent argument, all of those things that I did then, I don't need to do anymore because thanks to the miracles of modern technology, pretty much everything is available in digitized form, either on the internet, or if you have useful friends in the academic world, then you can even get material that is normally only available to scholars. And I stress this because this book is not written for scholars. I'm sure that for scholars, there's not very little in this that is totally new. But it is a book that I hope will be of some interest to thinking individuals who might simply find it something that prompts a living room conversation, such as the one that Nidhi and I are about to have. It's a book that takes up the story of the British Empire, not a British Empire in India, I should stress, because obviously they were all over the world. But I take it up not as a straightforward narrative, because that is something which obviously all of you can get from any other place. I take it up as an argument. And when I say take it up as an argument, what I'm trying to do is to essentially relive the whole terms of the Oxford debate by taking up the proposition that Britain has something to answer for its 200 years of injustice and rapacity and loot in this country, which in many ways we too have allowed them to forget. And the forgetting is quite large and quite deliberate. There is a level of historical amnesia in Britain that is truly staggering, sustained by various self-justificatory mythologies that are perpetuated by the British. Particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, you've seen a succession of best-selling historical books around the world. Neil Ferguson, very well-known book on the empire, and another book called Colossus about what he hoped would be the new American empire to replace the British, in which he argued that the British Empire had essentially laid the foundations for today's globalization by inventing the killer apps, as he called it, of modern civilization. Writers like Lawrence James, an author of other bestsellers, who describes the British Empire as the greatest exercise in benign altruism in human history. And what is interesting is that very little of these things actually were said or believed during the empire itself. During the empire, neither the perpetrators of the empire nor their critics, frankly, had any illusions about the motives of the colonists. The British were in it for the money, and they absolutely made no bones about it. But what was striking in the process was that the British were able to invent, to justify their loot, this myth of being on some sort of Enlightenment era mission to sort of bring civilization and self-government to the ignorant people of India, which of course was utter hogwash. It was even at the time seen by critics as fraudulent self-justification. But today people are beginning to write it as if it should be taken seriously, abetted by various rose-tinted television shows like Indian Summers or The Far Pavilions and so on, which add to this romanticization and myth-making about the empire. By contrast, in 1930, when the then young American historian Will Durant stopped in India in the course of his voyage of discovery and research to write what became his historic The Story of Civilization, he came to India and realized what was going on, interrupted his work on civilization to write a powerful short screed against the British called The Case for India, in which he actually said in one sentence that the ongoing loot of India is the greatest crime in all human history. And of course, he had a great deal of data to support it. I have built on the work of people like Durant, earlier Dadabhai Nauroji, R.C. Dutt, Jawaharlal Nehru. Many have written this during the colonial period. But I've also benefited from a lot of the current contemporary scholarship in academic journals and so on that have actually sought to understand details of the ways in which the British did this. So the book takes up the basic fact that India was one of the richest countries in the world when the British came here, and 200 years later they left it as one of the poorest countries in the world. They destroyed a country which had 23% of global GDP when they had less than 1%, and they reduced it to a country of less than 3% of global GDP while they had gone up to 10%. Much of Britain's prosperity was built on the drainage of resources from its empire, notably and most of all from India. But what I was surprised to discover in the process, not surprised, but what I was interested to discover in greater detail, was the extent to which, for example, they'd taken thriving industries they'd found, textiles, shipbuilding, and steel, and destroyed them, how they had rapaciously taxed the Indian peasantry at a level previously unknown under any other rulers, and through torture and cruelty, extracted vast sums of money and shipped it all off to England. How they had essentially robbed and plundered various treasuries across the country. How, in the name of good governance, they had essentially brought to ruin a thriving economy, including through laws, taxes, tariffs, and imports, all of which I've given plenty of details of in the book. And how, in turn, they had imposed their exports and their products on the back of the Indian consumer. On top of all of this, of course, there were a number of things that they claim credit for that I'm sure Nidhi will want to talk about, so I won't go into detail, but it is said, for example, that we should be grateful that the British left behind the railways, the rule of law, parliamentary democracy, the English language, cricket, even tea, and all of these, as I point out again with some detail in the book, every single one of these was brought in, installed, and operated purely for the benefit of the British and to serve the interests of British rule, continued British rule in India, had nothing to do with the well-being of the Indians. So this is essentially the broad thrust of the thesis. I go on at some length, but I hope in a readable way. I'm not writing, as I said, for serious, dry academics. I'm writing for people like all of you, who are presumably intelligent, thoughtful people who work in different fields, but know enough to be able to read these arguments and to engage with them. I'm obviously very happy to welcome disagreement, and I look forward to a dialogue not only with Nidhi, but with all of you after that. And I want to stress that at the end of the book, I do try to both sort of do a summary of the arguments without repeating anything that I've said before, but sort of prolonging with other examples and issues some of the arguments that buttress my case. and end also with a look at the afterlife of colonialism, ranging from the demands to reclaim the Kohinoor to the survival or not, as you may feel, of Gandhianism in our country and in the world. And all of this in the course of roughly about 300 pages, with a lot of endnotes for those who are curious to do further reading and want to check the sources on which I base my material. They're all listed with references to the pages in the book. But the book itself is not written full of footnotes or whatever. It's meant to be read by the casual reader. So that's broadly the story of an era of darkness. Some have asked me about whether the title is a deliberate allusion to V.S. Naipaul's An Area of Darkness. To some degree, I couldn't help but be conscious of that. The title is indeed intended to serve as a refutation to other kinds of outside writing about our country. At the same time, I have also made the point that this book seeks to portray the British in a rather unequivocal way, but it's not, to my mind, about India-British relations today. Those are the relations of two sovereign, equal countries, and as far as I'm concerned, we can move on. A lot of young people today in this auditorium may well say, well, it was 70 years ago, why don't we just move on? To which my answer very simply is, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? And I think even those of you whose eyes are fixed on the future, should think a little bit about the recent past. Because, as the last words in my book say, sometimes the best crystal ball is a rear view mirror. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much to all of you for coming here this evening. And Dr. Tharoor has covered, I think, pretty much all the subjects we were going to talk about. So we'll discuss the
index.
Except
not in detail.
We could discuss the index with him. No. But again, thank you so much for coming in this evening. And having been a history student myself, I read this book as soon as it came out in Delhi. And I found it interesting for many reasons. One was, and you touched upon that, why do you think people were just so surprised by sort of the negativity of the British Empire in India? I mean, we all grew up reading about Jallianwala Bagh. We all grew up reading about the freedom struggle. I studied it when I was a student. And yet, it's only when it's all been compiled in this book that it kind of strikes you about how bad it was. Well, why did that happen?
Well, I think it partially happened because we are a forgiving people. And yes, we knew about Jallianwala Bagh and a few other things. And as I said, almost everything in this book was available to us to know if we cared to know it. But we only knew just enough, if you like, to justify the freedom struggle, to justify the nationalist movement. We never wanted to dwell on it. Partly the temperament of our founding fathers, the initial heroes of national struggle, was such that they wanted to move on from that, and they wanted to preserve links in a curious way, rather like the American revolutionaries of 1776. They were fighting for the rights of Englishmen. And these were rights the English enjoyed and that denied to them, to us. So once they won those rights, they didn't see the point anymore, it seems to me, of continuing to harbor resentment. There's an anecdote which may be apocryphal, but which I heard from a reputable source in the book, in which I say that Nehru apparently was received by Churchill in the mid-1950s in London, and Churchill said to him, how come you don't show any bitterness or rancor towards us when we jailed you for about 10 years? For 10 years of your life was spent behind bars in a British prison. And Nehru replied, well, I was taught by a great man, meaning Mahatma Gandhi, never to fear and never to hate, which in many ways encapsulates, I think, the attitude, which is why, for example, we chose to stay on in the British Commonwealth, which even the British did not initially expect that India would agree to do. Up to then, Commonwealth had been a white countries club, and as we'd broken free of British domination, many assumed that we would just cut all those links. But Nehru actually decided to stay within the Commonwealth and stay associated with the association of countries that had previously ruled. And this has been very much our attitude. We tend to celebrate the things we have in common with them rather than deplore what they did wrong. I don't see anything terribly wrong in that, because I think I'm not anxious to whip up resentments either. What I'm anxious to do is to educate, is to make sure that people are aware. But beyond that, I think one must face the past for itself rather than let it necessarily be a source of continuing resentment today.
So let me ask you then in some detail about the various issues that you've touched on, and then follow up from there. And I'll begin with one of the earlier chapters where you've talked about how they looted India and India's economy. And as you pointed out here on page 4 of that chapter, that India's share of the world economy was 23% when the British came. And by the time they left, it had dropped to just over 3%. And you've talked about the systematic destruction of industries from textile to steel. If you could go into that in more detail, are you basically suggesting that we would have been a rich, prosperous, educated, much better off country if the British hadn't come?
Absolutely. That is what I'm suggesting. Well, you can take all the examples, and as I said, there's a lot of detail in the book about it. We were the leading textile country in the world, manufacturing country in the world, as well as the leading textile exporter in the world. Particularly Bengal, not in those days Gujarat, but Bengal was a very, very major center of textiles. The high quality cottons, linens, muslins were renowned around the world, so much so that there is evidence in the 16th and 17th centuries of British shopkeepers passing off shoddy British-made goods as made in India in order to command a higher price, because Indian textiles were considered so much more superior. And what the British did was they systematically destroyed this. They broke the looms of the weavers, depopulated the major textile capital, which was Dhaka, in at least and tariffs on the export of Indian textiles, whatever little was still being made, and of course instead started flooding the market with their own goods. That was how they destroyed textiles. Now, of course, by the late 19th century, and Gujarat is a very good example, Indians had started manufacturing as well. But imagine if we had done so when we were at the top of the heap, as it were, if we were already commanding the largest world's market share in textiles, and then had seen the new technological developed machines and so on, and made our own innovations as any entrepreneur would, we might well have been a far, far bigger player in global textiles then than we ever became. The second example is shipbuilding. We used to make the finest ships in the world. The quality of Indian shipmaking craftsmanship was so high that our ships were admired by the British. After they started conquering large chunks of India, they started manufacturing ships in India, because Indian wood, that is teak and mahogany and sal, were actually far superior to the British wood of fir and pine. So the average British ship in those days, they were all wooden ships, as you realize, lasted about 7 or 8 years, whereas the average Indian ship lasted more than 25 years. So there was no comparison. It was also not only a better ship, but lasted longer and was better business.
And you said even Indian swords were superior to their swords.
So that's coming to steel. So shipbuilding, anyway, they destroyed that, and they passed a number of laws. For example, one ingenious law prohibited ships made in India, because even the British started making ships in India. British companies and British owners, in order to ply the trade routes to London. So they passed laws making it illegal for ships made in India to sail to London, as a result of which essentially the shipbuilding industry was destroyed. Then steel. This is something even I didn't know when I made the Oxford speech, found out in my research. We were the world leaders in steel production. India had invented steel. It was called Ukku steel because it was invented in Karnataka, Kannada, in the Kannada language, Ukku was the word. Ukku steel got repeated as a word by the Europeans as Wook, and Wook became Woots. So it appears in the literature as W-O-O-T-Z, but that wood steel is actually not a European word or a German or Polish invention. It is actually an Indian invention. Our steel technology was so superior that the Arabs came and learned from us and took it to the Arab world to use the famous Damascus steel, which is actually Indian technology manufactured in the Arab world. And our steel was so famous that when the British soldiers came to India, in the 17th and 18th centuries, when they shot an Indian soldier, they would dismount from their horses and steal his sword, because the Indian swords were so much superior to any sword that the British, that of European manufacture that they could carry. That was the extraordinary extent to which this the steel was. So they destroyed all of these industries, Nidhi. I mean, and there's also taxation. And then they took all this money directly to England. You know, I mean, it's one thing to destroy, it's another thing to drain whatever resources there are. And that's what they did systematically. An English writer, William Digby, estimated at the turn of the 20th century, about 1904, I think, that over 4 billion pounds in those days' money, which would be more like $500 billion today, had been drained just on the recorded accounts of the East India Company and Her Majesty's government to England.
And as you said in the book repeatedly, that this was a deliberate policy. You've said some apologists for British rule have argued that India basically missed the bus for industrialization. India couldn't keep up with technological innovations, which you've argued is completely disputable, because this was out and out a deliberate British policy.
As I say, if we missed the bus, it's because you threw us under the wheels. The British quite deliberately destroyed. And, you know, you can see even, for example, on steel, when almost a century later, Jamshedji Tata tries to set up a steel industry, modern steel industry in India, the runaround the British gave him, it took him over 2 decades to get all the permissions. And finally, he died before the first steel could be produced. It was his son, Dorabji Tata, who produced the first steel coming out of Jamshedpur. So the British were absolutely systematically opposed to Indians developing industrial manufacture. In fact, when Jamshedji Tata was trying, a senior British official at the time, the then chairman of the railway board, sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. It's only a pity that he didn't live long enough to see Jamshedji Tata's descendants take over the remnants of British steel when they bought Chorus a few years ago. That might have given him a bad case of indigestion.
Interesting when we talk about what motivated the British to come here, and you mentioned that on page 113, saying that they weren't motivated such as, you know, the zeal of spreading Christianity, and it was basically to make money out of India. India was a career, it wasn't a crusade.
Absolutely. In fact, the British officials were the best paid officials in the world. If you wanted to make a lot of money for very little work, come to India was the philosophy.
Civil service in particular.
The civil servants were the best paid civil service, higher paid than the American civil service or the British civil service in Britain. They were extremely well paid. They only had to serve 20 years, which included 4 years of paid holidays at home, quote unquote, in England. And at the end of that, they were guaranteed a lifetime pension paid for by the Indian taxpayer. And they had extremely high salaries, most of which they repatriated home because it was far more than they could spend in India. It really was an absolutely outrageous thing. But I think at every stage, and I even find you quotes as late as the 1920s and 30s from a British Home Secretary at the time, openly admitting that Britain was in India for the money. In fact, the Home Secretary, whose name slips my mind for the moment, but it's in the book, actually said that, you know, we seized India with the sword and we ruled it with the measuring tape, for words to that effect. And we shall continue to hold it by the sword. All this talk about being there for the good of the Indians is utter humbug and cant. We are there for our own good and our own profit, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So some of them are very honest about their motives, much more. But the truth is that there was a lot of the self-justification for sort of public relations purposes.
Well, the people you call apologists for British rule may not necessarily be apologists, but those of us who look at the legacy of their rule and look at schools, colleges, you mentioned that in your introduction, schools, colleges, courts, a free press. We do see these as things we have inherited from the British. Maybe not, I mean, they may not have set out to do it for our benefit, but we have used those to our benefit. You don't see a positive in that?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, that all of these things that we give the British credit for are reflections of modern life, which many countries have acquired without having to go to the trouble and expense of being colonized. I mean, you don't have to be colonized to build a railway system. You don't have to be colonized to develop a press. I mean, Thailand has done it, Japan has done it, China has done it. No one colonized them. So the fact is that if you look at each of these things in turn, there's no question that they came in for a very different and disreputable motive. Should we talk about the railways, for example? Yeah. So if you take the railways, today we think, wow, what a good thing, thank God the British built it. But the British openly said the reason they were building these railways was in order to exploit the goods and resources from the Indian hinterland, in order to ship them to the port, track them to the ports and ship them to Britain, that it would help them move labor, for example, to the mines, the forests, the places they were despoiling in order to get the goodies, that the entire purpose of the railways was to serve British commercial interests. Then when they built the railways, they made it the best and most profitable investment that a British person could make. In fact, from the 1850s to the 1870s, there was no higher remuneration investment available in the entire London Stock Exchange than the Indian Railways, because there was a guaranteed rate of return. A guaranteed rate of return was offered to the British investor from the Indian taxpayer. So they had a cushy time. And as a result, of course, there was no limit on expenses because Indians were paying for it anyway, with the result that each mile of Indian railway being built cost 9 times what the same 1 mile cost in America, in Britain, in Canada, in Australia. 9 times. And the reason they were doing this is because let's exploit the Indians, let them pay for it. Then they built it, they ran it for themselves. When Indian passengers started also trying to take advantage of the new system in order to get around the country. And remember, the tracks were not built to cater to passenger demand. They were built to cater to British purposes. But when they added these wagons with those deplorable wooden benches, the slats that served as seats, they charged Indian passengers the highest passenger rates in the world, while they charged British companies the lowest freight rates in the world. So right up to independence, it was an extremely good, in fact, the expression used at the time was private profit at public risk. The private profit was British, the public risk was Indian. That was what the railways was all about. And I also talk about the racism of the way it was run, right up to the First World War, for example. Every single employee except the most menial had to be a European. Even the ticket collectors and station masters were Europeans. When finally they ran out of European men, as the world generally lost quite a few of them fighting in the trenches in the First World War, they then looked around for the most European-like they could find, so that's when the Anglo-Indians started getting hired for the railway industry in India. Everything was run from this disgusting sort of colonial perspective, anti-Indian perspective, and it's only after independence that we reversed the logic, that we actually managed, for example, to make the passenger fares the cheapest, to add new lines to cater to the demand of Indians for transportation, and to then go ahead and raise the freight rates. Now, in the Ahmedabad Management Association, I'll have to admit that maybe the policy went too far, and now freight rates are so high that as a result, too many companies are shipping their goods on our over-congested highways and polluting our environment on trucks and lorries. But the fact is that at least Indian policies were being made to serve Indian interests only after independence. Right up to then, the railways were a gigantic colonial scam.
But apart from the railways, the other institutions I talked about, for instance, do you believe that India would have been the kind of parliamentary democracy that it is today? What would India have been if the British hadn't come? Would we have been a democracy necessarily? Look at our neighborhood, for instance.
I think democracies could have evolved. I mean, democracy could have evolved. I agree that its counterfactuals are always hypothetical. I know sometimes you media people love hypotheticals, but the truth is that my guess is as good as yours. But I'll tell you what my guess is. My guess is that if no colonial power had intervened and Indians were left to sort out their mess for themselves, if you look through the history of India, the idea of India as one goes right back to the Vedas. Bharatvash, the land between the Himalayas and the oceans, was an idea from then. Shankaracharya, Adi Shankara from my state of Kerala, went all the way up to Kashmir, went all the way to Dwarka in the west, to Puri in the east, established his mutts. There was very much a shared sense of a civilizational heritage, what the Harvard scholar Diana Eck calls the sacred geography of India, knit together by tracks of pilgrimage. But it wasn't just a Hindu idea, lest some of my Gujarati friends think that I'm suddenly crossing over to the wrong side. I am a very proud Hindu, but let me say that Maulana Azad has written about how Indian Muslims going on the Hajj were greeted by other Muslims, including particularly the Arabs, as Hindi, whether they were Pathans or Tamils or Gujaratis. The fact is, the notion of Hind was established in the global consciousness. And at various times, emperors had tried to transform that into a political and territorial reality. Obviously, Ashoka and Chandragupta in the Maurya period, less successful attempts by the Guptas, by the Vijayanagar Empire, and so on. Then, of course, you had the Mughals, who really went pretty far across the subcontinent. And the only thing that prevented the complete unity of Bharatvarsh was undoubtedly the communications and transport limitations of that era. By the time the modern era had come around, I don't see any reason why that knitting together of the country could not have happened under an Indian ruler. Who would it have been? Well, history suggests that at that point, the people in the ascendant were the Marathas. Yes, they'd had a major setback in 1761 of the Second Battle of Panipat against Ahmad Shah Abdali, but Abdali had left. Marathas could have recovered if the British hadn't intervened and grown their own power. And you could well imagine a situation they had already conducted themselves somewhat sensibly as the de facto rulers while leaving the Mughal emperor propped up as their hostage in Delhi. So you could well imagine a consolidation of much of the country under de facto Maratha rule initially with the Mughal emperor as a constitutional figurehead. And gradually, that constitutional figurehead, because he was already pretty weak, would preside over a large country with, of course, strong regional autonomy and a civilian rulership, which initially would have been predominantly Maratha, but because there weren't enough Marathas to rule the entire place, it would have, I think, like other empires, ended up accommodating other interests. The Marathas themselves had lots of non-Maratha generals and courtiers in their ranks, and I think inevitably that sort of thing would have happened. If you look, for example, at how Japan modernized under an ancient monarchy and ended up with strong civilian rulers while preserving the titular position of the king, we could have done something similar.
But what about other institutions, for instance, a free press? And you've argued in the book that it wasn't as free as we thought it was.
It wasn't free for the Indians, it was free for the Brits.
Exactly. But the idea of a free press began at that time. And also, let's face it, they brought us the English language. You and I might have been speaking English like the Chinese, no offense, today, if they hadn't come. And that the English language is a big advantage for us today in the world order. Okay,
so as far as the English language is concerned, I mean, again, the British didn't sort of give it to us with any benefit for us intended. Macaulay was quite clear in his notorious Minute of 1835, where he basically said that we should not make any effort to teach English to the Indian masses. We should teach it to a small, narrow stratum of Indian society, who would be, as he put it in that famous phrase, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, who would essentially serve as a class of almost interpreters between the rulers and the ruled, between the British and the rest of us. And the purpose was essentially to enhance and perpetuate British control. I mean, 90% of those in India who learned English never learned it well enough to hold their own against the Brits, but only well enough to be sort of clerks and lower level officials to serve the British. Never posing a serious threat to the British, but often becoming the caricatured Babu that you read about in Kipling's Kim and so on. At the same time, the fact that Indians seized upon this language, educated themselves in it, and turned it into an instrument of their own liberation is to the credit of those Indians, not the British, because the British didn't intend to do this. The British had no desire to use the Indians, to use education to help Indians discover the injustices being perpetrated against them. So I think that, yes, we're glad to have the English language today. And history has brought us to the point where we have a language, or at least some of us have a language. As many others point out, it is still a minority, a small minority in our country that has the language. But that language is an asset to all of us who have it in terms of any international role we want to play, foreign contacts, businesses, customers, etc. And it has served to link us together. But don't forget that linked languages existed in the past as well, whether it was Sanskrit among the elite of the old days, whether it was the various Prakrits, whether it was, for that matter, Persian in the Mughal court and indeed the court of the Delhi Sultans before that. A lot of people learned Persian who were not Muslim. The entire Kaya subcaste rose up by their mastery of Persian, which made them scribes and made them indispensable in the administration. So all of these things, maybe we'd be having this conversation in Persian if that had continued. Who knows? But the fact is that a linked language, I think, would have evolved. But again, I'd much rather have had some pretty young British VSOs teaching us English than sturdy British master sergeants coming and thrusting it down with their boot and their baton.
Another important part of your book, of course, is the Hindu-Muslim divide. And you said that large-scale conflicts, it's clear, between Hindus and Muslims that were religiously defined only began under colonial rule. Many other kinds of social strife were labeled as religious due to the colonists' assumptions that religion was a fundamental division in Indian society. So are you saying that Hindu-Muslim divisions based on religious lines should entirely be blamed on them?
Yeah, pretty much entirely. And I'll say this because whereas there had been clashes between Hindus and Muslims in the past in various parts of the country, very rarely were these clashes because one was a Hindu and the other was a Muslim. There were clashes, invaders coming to attack and loot happened to be Muslim and their victims happened to be Hindu, but there are also examples available of Hindu kings attacking Hindu temples of their enemies because the temple was a symbol of their opponent's sovereignty, including raiding temples for their idols and jewels in the idols and so on. So it was not as if it was impossible for us to actually have examples of all of this. Similarly, Aurangzeb, whom we think of as the worst of the Mughals, had a number of Hindu generals, had a number of Hindu courtiers. Tipu Sultan in Mysore is today being blamed by certain political elements in our country as a scourge of Hindus and Christians in Mysore. But in fact, every single one of his cabinet ministers and his leading courtiers was actually Hindu. And he actually, yes, he did destroy a few temples, but he also endowed far more temples than he destroyed and paid for their building and their maintenance. Some scholars have explained this phenomenon throughout Indian history with example after example, one scholar working in the south, one in the north, as not, and this is where one gets into controversial territory, not Muslims attacking Hindu temples, but as a phenomenon of the advancing frontier. Because remember, there were no borders drawn as we began to think of borders in the 19th century. Anywhere in the world, the power of an empire or a kingdom or a principality extended as far as its power could take its line, and the line would shift depending on how strong you became. Or it would shrink if your successors didn't have the ability to hold on to your power. So when the frontier advanced, you came up against the chap on the other side of that frontier, the ruler, the king, whoever it was, and you attacked him and the symbols of his strength and support. Many, many Indian rulers essentially claimed to derive their power from a divinity. Right now, I'm a member of Parliament of Thiruvananthapuram. The Maharaja of Travancore would call himself Padmanabha Dasa. He never called himself Maharaja. He was the servant of Lord Padmanabha, who was the god for whom this magnificent temple that still exists, going back to the 7th century, the Padmanabha Swami Kshetram, exists. Now, so if you wanted to undermine the source of that Maharaja's power, you would attack his temple. Didn't matter whether you were yourself a believer or a Hindu or a Muslim or whatever. So what these scholars are arguing is that we are seeing as Hindu-Muslim things that were actually purely, if you like, what we today call political. Now, when you look at what the British did, however, it was a very different story. In 1857, which they dismissed as a mutiny and many of us think of as the first major revolt, in 1857, the British were horrified to see Hindus and Muslims fighting together side by side under the banner of the enfeebled Mughal emperor against the common enemy, the British. And they vowed that this must not be allowed to happen again. So Lord Elphinstone wrote a famous memo in which he said, divide et impera was the ancient Roman maxim, and it shall be ours. Divide et impera means divide and rule. And actually, his history wasn't that hot. It wasn't an ancient Roman maxim. It was an ancient Macedonian maxim. It was the maxim of Philip II, Alexander's father. But many Roman emperors practiced the same policy when they expanded their empire. And the British said, we have to divide. So they saw this country potentially as easiest to divide on religious lines. So they very consciously and deliberately, I've given example after example in the book, tried to foment a separate Muslim consciousness. So when the Indian National Congress was created in 1885, and its first few presidents included Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Parsis, instead of sort of welcoming this as a representative body which involved really all segments of Indian opinion, the British essentially encouraged, lobbied for, and helped finance the creation of the Muslim League as a rival body, deliberately in order to divide and split the nationalist movement. In 1905, they decided to partition Bengal, and they explicitly did so, telling Muslims they're going to give you, for the first time, a Muslim majority province in Bengal. And a number of irresponsible statements were made by Muslim leaders. When the first plan came up, the Nawab of Dhaka, who was a Muslim nobleman in Bengal, said this plan is a beastly idea, I'll never stand for it. So the British quietly slipped him 100,000 pounds, a lakh of pounds, and he changed his tune and became a supporter of partition. The British had a very deliberate policy of trying to encourage this division right up to partition. The Second World War, the way in which, for example, the Muslim League's membership went up from a couple of lakhs to a couple of crores during the war years, when the Congress leadership first had resigned all their ministers